Sometimes the most powerful moments happen without a single word being spoken. In a crowded restaurant on a warm California evening, what began as a romantic dinner between two people would transform into something far more significant. It would become a moment that revealed the true character of America's most elite warriors and remind everyone present that respect isn't just a word, it's a principle worth standing for. The clash of silverware against plates filled the air, mixed with gentle conversations and soft laughter. Nobody expected that within minutes, this peaceful scene would be shattered by an act of violence so shocking that it would awaken something primal in the hearts of those trained to protect and serve. What happened next wasn't planned, wasn't rehearsed, and wasn't coordinated by any commanding officer. It was simply the natural response of men who had sworn an oath to defend those who cannot defend themselves. This is the story of how one man's moment of cruelty became his greatest mistake, and how the silent solidarity of Navy SEALs turned an ordinary evening into an unforgettable lesson about honor, respect, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility through the open windows of Coronado's most popular seafood restaurant. It was a Friday evening in late spring, the kind of night when military personnel from the nearby Naval Special Warfare Command would venture out to enjoy some well-deserved relaxation after grueling training sessions that pushed human limits beyond what most people could imagine. Table 12 near the window held a group of 6 Navy SEALs. Still relatively young in their careers, but already bearing the quiet confidence that comes from surviving some of the military's most demanding selection processes. They had completed their evening meal and were sharing stories over coffee, their conversation punctuated by the easy laughter of men who trusted each other with their lives on a regular basis. Marcus Rodriguez, a petty officer second class with 3 deployments under his belt, was in the middle of recounting a training mishap that had left his entire platoon covered in mud, when something caught his attention at the table directly across from them. The couple appeared to be having what looked like an increasingly heated discussion, though their voices were still low enough not to disturb other diners. The woman, probably in her late 20s with shoulder-length brown hair, kept glancing around nervously as the man across from her leaned forward with obvious agitation. She wore a simple blue dress that suggested this had started as a special occasion, perhaps an anniversary dinner or celebration. Her companion, a heavy-set man with graying temples and an expensive suit, gestured sharply as he spoke, his face growing redder with each passing moment. The SEALs continued their own conversation, but years of training had made them naturally aware of their surroundings. When you've spent time in hostile environments where a moment's inattention can mean the difference between life and death, you develop an almost unconscious habit of monitoring everything happening around you, even in seemingly safe civilian spaces. The woman's voice rose slightly, enough for fragments of her words to carry across the small distance between tables. She was trying to explain something, her tone pleading and apologetic, but the man's response was to slam his hand down on the table hard enough to make their wine glasses jump, and nearby diners turn their heads. Restaurant staff noticed the disturbance, but like most service workers, they were caught in the difficult position of wanting to maintain a peaceful atmosphere while not wanting to escalate a situation that might resolve itself. The manager, a middle-aged woman with 20 years of experience handling difficult customers, approached cautiously and offered to move the couple to a more private table if they needed space to talk. The man's response was swift and brutal. He told the manager to mind her own business in language that made several nearby families uncomfortable, then turned his fury back on his companion. The woman had tears forming in her eyes, but she was trying hard to maintain her composure, probably hoping the situation would calm down if she could just get through whatever had made him so angry. The conversation at the SEALs table had gradually died down as they became more focused on what was happening nearby. These were men trained to recognize threat patterns, to assess situations quickly and determine when intervention might be necessary. What they were witnessing had all the hallmarks of a situation that could escalate beyond verbal abuse. James Peterson, a chief petty officer who served as the informal leader of their group, caught the eyes of his teammates with a subtle look that they all understood. They had worked together long enough to communicate without words when necessary. The look said, "Pay attention, be ready, but don't do anything yet." The woman tried to stand up, perhaps thinking she could excuse herself to the restroom and give both of them time to cool down. But the man grabbed her wrist and pulled her back down into her chair with enough force that she gasped in pain. Several people in the restaurant saw this happen, but the bystander effect was in full swing. People looked uncomfortable, whispered to their companions, and hoped someone else would handle the situation. The woman rubbed her wrist where he had grabbed her, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, clearly trying to de-escalate. She apologized for whatever had upset him, promised they could talk about it later, when they were both calmer, and suggested they should probably head home. Her body language showed someone who had experience managing this type of situation, someone who had learned to navigate carefully around an explosive temper. But the man was beyond reasoning. He had been drinking throughout dinner, and whatever had initially triggered his anger had now grown into something much larger. He began to berate her more loudly, criticizing everything from her appearance to her intelligence to her family, using increasingly personal and cruel language that made even strangers feel uncomfortable on her behalf. The SEALs found themselves in a position they knew well from their professional lives, watching a situation develop, gathering information, and preparing for the moment when action would become necessary. In combat zones, this kind of situational awareness could mean the difference between a successful mission and a disaster. In a restaurant in California, it meant being ready to protect someone who might not be able to protect herself. The woman's attempts to calm the situation were becoming more desperate. She reached across the table to touch his hand in what appeared to be a gesture of affection or reconciliation, but he knocked her hand away with enough force that she pulled it back quickly, cradling it against her chest. The message was clear. She was not allowed to touch him, not allowed to try to comfort him or calm him down. Other diners were beginning to ask for their checks, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that was building in the restaurant. Families with children were particularly eager to leave, not wanting their evening out to turn into something their kids shouldn't witness. The restaurant staff huddled together near the kitchen, discussing in hushed tones whether they should call the police or try to handle the situation themselves. The man's voice grew louder as he launched into what sounded like a familiar litany of complaints and accusations. This was clearly not the first time the woman had been subjected to this kind of verbal assault, and her responses showed the practiced patience of someone who had learned that fighting back would only make things worse. She nodded at appropriate moments, agreed with his criticisms, and continued to apologize for things that, to outside observers, seemed like normal human behavior. The SEALs watched this dynamic with growing discomfort. These were men who had dedicated their lives to protecting others, who had sworn oaths to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. They had seen oppression and abuse in many forms during their deployments overseas, and they recognized the pattern that was unfolding in front of them. The power imbalance was obvious. The man felt he had the right to treat this woman however he chose, and she had learned to accept it as normal. When the woman tried once more to suggest they leave, perhaps sensing that the public nature of his outburst was only making him angrier, the man made a decision that would change the trajectory of everyone's evening. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and pointed his finger directly in her face as he delivered what was clearly meant to be a final, devastating verbal blow. The words he chose were designed to humiliate her completely, to strip away any remaining dignity she might have maintained during their public argument.
He called her worthless, stupid, and pathetic, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear clearly.
Then he told her she was lucky to have him, because nobody else would ever want someone so useless and disgusting. The woman's face went completely pale, and for a moment she looked as though she might collapse from the sheer cruelty of his words. But instead of breaking down completely, she did something that surprised everyone watching. She found her voice and told him quietly but firmly that she deserved better treatment than this. That simple statement of self-worth, delivered with remarkable dignity under the circumstances, was apparently the last thing the man wanted to hear. His face contorted with rage, and in front of a restaurant full of witnesses, he drew back his hand and struck her across the face with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence that fell over the entire dining room. The woman's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, and she raised her hand to her cheek in shock. For a moment, she seemed frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened. Then, as she slowly turned back to face him, the man did something that revealed the true depth of his cruelty. He laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter or the kind of uncomfortable sound someone might make when they realize they've gone too far. It was genuine amusement, as though her pain and humiliation were entertaining to him. He seemed to find her shock and hurt genuinely funny, and his laughter continued as he looked around the restaurant, as if expecting others to share in his amusement at having put this woman in her place. That was the moment when 6 Navy SEALs, without any discussion or coordination, rose from their chairs in perfect unison. They didn't speak, they didn't make threats, and they didn't rush toward the man who had just committed an act of violence in front of dozens of witnesses. They simply stood up at exactly the same time and looked directly at him. The effect was immediate and profound. The man's laughter died in his throat as he suddenly found himself staring at 6 of America's most elite warriors, all focused entirely on him. These were men whose physical presence alone commanded respect, who carried themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from facing and overcoming challenges that would break ordinary people. Their silence was far more intimidating than any words could have been. The restaurant had become so quiet that the only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Every conversation had stopped. Every fork had been set down. Every eye in the place was focused on the unfolding drama, but most of all, everyone was watching the 6 SEALs who stood like silent sentinels beside their table. The man who had just struck the woman found himself in a position he clearly had not anticipated. What had seemed like a moment of private power and control had suddenly become very public, and the audience was not appreciating his performance. The laughter that had seemed so satisfying to him moments before now felt hollow and desperate in the face of such overwhelming disapproval. Chief Petty Officer James Peterson took a single step forward. It wasn't aggressive or threatening in the traditional sense, but it was purposeful. Years of leadership had taught him that sometimes the most powerful communication happens without words. His movement was measured and deliberate, designed to close the distance just enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. The woman, still holding her hand to her reddening cheek, looked up at the SEALs with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. She had probably spent so long being told that she deserved this treatment that having strangers willing to stand up for her was almost overwhelming. Tears were forming in her eyes, but they weren't just tears of pain anymore. There was something else there, something that looked like hope. The man tried to regain his composure, to reassert the dominance he had been wielding so effectively just moments before. He straightened his shoulders and attempted to stare down the SEALs, but the effect was pathetic rather than intimidating. These were men who had stared down actual enemies in life-and-death situations. A civilian having a temper tantrum in a restaurant was not going to shake their confidence. Other patrons in the restaurant began to realize they were witnessing something significant. This wasn't just about one couple's domestic dispute anymore. This was about the kind of society people wanted to live in, about whether violence against women would be tolerated or challenged. The SEALs had made their position clear without saying a word, and their silent stand was inspiring others to find their own courage. An elderly veteran at a corner table recognized the bearing and demeanor of the young men who had stood up. He had served in Vietnam, and he knew military men when he saw them. He made eye contact with Chief Peterson and nodded slowly, a gesture of respect from one generation of warriors to another. Then, with some difficulty due to his age, he pushed himself up from his chair and stood as well. The effect was like dropping a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward as more and more people throughout the restaurant began to stand. A middle-aged couple who had been celebrating their anniversary rose together, their hands clasped. A group of college students abandoned their appetizers and stood up, their faces serious, with newfound understanding of what it meant to take a stand for what's right. Within minutes, nearly everyone in the restaurant was on their feet, all of them looking at the man who had struck the woman. He found himself the center of attention in the worst possible way, facing not just 6 Navy SEALs, but an entire room full of people who had decided that his behavior was unacceptable. The woman slowly rose from her chair, perhaps feeling for the first time in a long while that she had allies, that she wasn't alone in thinking that she deserved better treatment. Her posture was different now, straighter and more confident, as though the support of all these strangers had reminded her of her own worth. The manager who had tried to intervene earlier approached the situation with new authority. She was no longer just trying to minimize a disturbance in her restaurant. She was backed by a room full of people who had made it clear that violence would not be tolerated in their presence.
This is
She asked the man to leave immediately, and her voice carried the weight of everyone standing behind her. The man looked around desperately, perhaps hoping to find someone who would side with him, someone who would argue that this was a private matter between him and the woman. But every face he saw reflected the same message. What he had done was wrong, and they weren't going to pretend otherwise just to avoid getting involved. Some of the people standing began to speak quietly to the woman, offering support and asking if she needed help. A woman at a nearby table opened her purse and pulled out a business card, explaining that she was a social worker and could provide information about resources and support services. Another diner, a lawyer, mentioned that she had witnessed the assault and would be willing to provide a statement if the woman decided to press charges. The man realized that his evening had taken a turn he could never have predicted. What had started as an opportunity to assert his control over someone he viewed as powerless had turned into a public humiliation that would likely have consequences extending far beyond this one night. The room full of strangers had transformed from passive observers into active participants in holding him accountable for his actions. Chief Peterson spoke for the first time since standing up, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. He told the man that it was time for him to leave, and that he should do so immediately and without causing any further disturbance. There was no threat in his words. But the implication was clear. Continued resistance would not be tolerated. The other SEALs remained silent, but their presence spoke volumes. These were men trained in hand-to-hand combat, experts in neutralizing threats, and specialists in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The man facing them understood instinctively that he was completely outmatched, not just numerically but in every way that mattered.
The woman took a step away from the table, creating physical distance between herself and the man who had struck her. For the first time that evening, she looked like she was making choices based on her own needs, rather than trying to manage his anger.
The support of the room seemed to be giving her strength to assert her own agency in the situation. One of the SEALs, Petty Officer Rodriguez, moved to position himself between the woman and the man, not in a threatening way but in a protective stance that made it clear she would not be subjected to further violence while they were present. The message was unmistakable. If the man wanted to continue his aggressive behavior, he would have to go through them first. The man's bravado began to crumble under the weight of so much unified opposition. The message was up. His voice, which had been so loud and commanding when he was berating the woman, became smaller and more defensive as he tried to justify his actions. He claimed that the situation had been misunderstood, that it was a private matter, that outsiders had no right to interfere.
But the room full of witnesses had seen what they had seen, and no amount of explaining or justifying was going to change the fact that he had struck a woman and then laughed about it. The collective judgment was clear, and it was not in his favor.
The restaurant's other patrons began to return to their seats, but their attention remained focused on the situation. They had made their statement by standing up, and now they were prepared to see it through to its conclusion. The woman was no longer isolated and helpless. She had a room full of allies, and, most importantly, she had begun to remember her own strength.
The man looked around one more time, perhaps hoping the situation would somehow return to what it had been before he struck the woman, but there was no going back.
His moment of violence had revealed his character to everyone present, and their silent stand had revealed theirs. The balance of power in the room had shifted completely, and it was not going to shift back. The standoff that had gripped the restaurant for what felt like an eternity was finally beginning to reach its resolution. The man who had seemed so powerful and in control just minutes earlier now appeared small and uncertain. Faced with the unified disapproval of an entire room of people who had decided his behavior was unacceptable, Chief Peterson maintained his position calm and steady while his fellow SEALs continued their silent vigil. Years of training had taught them that sometimes the most effective action is simply being present, showing that certain lines cannot be crossed without consequences.
They didn't need to make threats or engage in aggressive posturing. Their mere presence was enough to communicate that violence against the defenseless would not be tolerated.
The woman slowly began to gather her purse and jacket from the back of her chair. Her movements were deliberate and careful, as though she was finally making decisions based on her own needs rather than trying to avoid triggering someone else's anger. The mark on her face was becoming more visible as the initial shock wore off, a stark reminder of what had prompted this extraordinary response from the restaurant's patrons. Several people approached her quietly, offering support and resources. A woman from across the room handed her a tissue and whispered words of encouragement. An older gentleman, the Vietnam veteran who had been among the first to stand up, told her that she had shown great courage and that she deserved to be treated with respect. A young mother with children at her table made sure the woman had her phone number in case she needed someone to call. The man made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. He raised his voice and declared that everyone was overreacting, that what had happened between him and the woman was none of their business, that couples have disagreements and outsiders should mind their own affairs. His words fell flat in the room, met with stony silence and disapproving looks. One of the younger SEALs, Petty Officer 3rd Class Michael Chen, spoke quietly but clearly enough for the man to hear. He said that real men don't strike women, and they certainly don't laugh about it afterward. His words carried the weight of someone who had sworn an oath to protect others, someone who understood that strength should be used to defend the vulnerable, not to intimidate them. The restaurant manager approached the situation with new confidence, backed by a room full of customers who had made their position clear. She informed the man that the police had been called and that he needed to leave the premises immediately. Her voice was steady and professional, but there was no mistaking the authority behind her words. The silent stand of the patrons had given her the support she needed to take decisive action. The man looked around one final time, perhaps hoping to find even one sympathetic face in the crowd, someone who would agree that he was being unfairly persecuted for what he clearly viewed as a minor transgression. But every person he looked at reflected the same message back to him.
What he had done was wrong, and they weren't going to pretend otherwise, to spare his feelings. The woman stepped away from the table, moving toward the group of people who had surrounded her with offers of support. For the first time that evening, she seemed to be making choices based on her own well-being, rather than trying to manage someone else's emotions.
The transformation was remarkable to witness, as though the collective support of strangers had reminded her of her own worth and agency. As the man finally began to move toward the restaurant's exit, his departure was watched by everyone present.
There was no celebration or cheering, just a quiet sense of satisfaction that justice had been served, that someone who had used his power to hurt another person had been held accountable for his actions. The SEALs remained standing until the man had completely left the building, their silent protection continuing until the threat had been fully removed. Only when they were certain the woman was safe did they finally return to their seats, their mission accomplished without violence or dramatic confrontation, simply through their willingness to stand up for what was right.
The atmosphere in the restaurant began to return to normal, but there was an underlying sense of connection among the patrons that hadn't existed before. They had shared something significant, a moment when ordinary people chose to act with courage and compassion, rather than turning away from someone else's pain.
The woman spent several more minutes talking with the people who had offered their support, exchanging contact information and learning about resources available to help her move forward. The social worker explained options for temporary housing and legal assistance.
The lawyer provided information about restraining orders and criminal charges. Most importantly, numerous people made sure she understood that what had happened to her was not acceptable and was not her fault.
When the police arrived, they found a restaurant full of witnesses eager to provide statements about what they had observed. The assault had taken place in front of dozens of people, making it impossible for the perpetrator to claim it had been misunderstood or exaggerated. The officers took detailed statements and photographs of the woman's injury, building a solid case that would hold up in court. The SEALs provided their contact information to the police as witnesses, but they downplayed their role in the evening's events. When questioned about their decision to stand up, Chief Peterson simply said that they had sworn an oath to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And that oath didn't stop applying when they took off their uniforms. As the evening wound down and the restaurant gradually emptied, the woman found herself surrounded by new allies and resources she hadn't known existed. The isolated, powerless person she had appeared to be at the beginning of the evening had been transformed by the support and solidarity of strangers who refused to allow violence to go unchallenged. The SEALs finished their coffee and prepared to leave, but not before checking once more with the woman to ensure she had transportation and a safe place to stay for the night. They exchanged contact information with her, making it clear that if she ever needed help or support, she could reach out to them without hesitation. The restaurant manager approached their table as they were settling their bill, thanking them for their intervention and telling them that their meals were on the house. Chief Peterson politely declined the offer, explaining that they had simply done what anyone should do when witnessing violence against another person. He paid the check in full and left a generous tip for their server, who had also been shaken by the evening's events. As the 6 Navy SEALs walked out into the cool California night, they reflected on what had transpired. None of them had expected their quiet dinner to turn into a moment that would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. They had simply responded to a situation that demanded action, using their training and their principles to protect someone who needed protection. The woman left the restaurant with phone numbers of new supporters, information about legal and social services, and most importantly, a restored sense of her own worth. The evening that had begun with humiliation and violence had ended with solidarity and hope, thanks to 6 warriors who understood that their duty to protect others extended far beyond their military service. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of what happened in that restaurant would be retold countless times. It would serve as a reminder that ordinary people have the power to stand up against injustice, that violence thrives in silence, but withers when confronted with collective courage. The man who had struck the woman and laughed about it would face legal consequences for his actions. But more importantly, he had learned that society would not tolerate his behavior. The room full of strangers who stood up that night had delivered a powerful message. Violence against women is not a private matter, and those who choose to hurt others will be held accountable by their community. The 6 Navy SEALs returned to their duties, continuing to serve their country and protect those who cannot protect themselves. But they would always remember the night when their silent stand in a civilian restaurant reminded everyone present that true strength lies not in the power to hurt others, but in the courage to defend them.